Hi, and welcome to Eminent Americans. I'm your host, Dan Oppenheimer, first over the barricades of the contemporary American intellectual scene. This episode with Democratic congressional candidate Caitlin Rourke has an interesting backstory. So back in May of 2025, my wife, Jessica, wrote an op-ed for the Austin American-Statesman attacking Republican Congressman John Carter, who represents the 31st Congressional District, which is kind of adjacent to the one that we actually live in, but it's part of the Austin coverage area. She attacked him not because he's particularly noxious as far as Republican congressmen go, but just because he's the one who's closest to us and he's been utterly complicit with Trump and MAGA. He just kind of bends with the winds. And my wife, like many of us at that time and now, although somewhat less so, was feeling kind of powerless about all the just shit that Trump and his administration was raining down on us. And writing the op-ed was a way to feel like she was doing something. I mean, the hope was that it would sort of put Carter on notice, to whatever extent he pays attention to the local news, that people are attaching him to Trump and they see what he's doing and more importantly, not doing, which is standing up for any kind of principle. So she wrote that op-ed. Let me read a bit of it just to give you a sense. Republican Congressman John Carter, whose 31st district covers North Austin up to northwest of Waco, has long styled himself an old-school defender of the U.S. Constitution. He invokes the founding document frequently to oppose hate crime legislation, advocate for gun rights, criticize the Affordable Care Act, and decry executive actions by Democratic presidents. He presents himself as a public servant guided by deep constitutional principles. When it comes to Donald Trump, however, those principles disappear. In recent months, and again, this was published in May, Trump has been openly contemptuous of the Constitution and its embedded system of checks and balances. He's willfully ignored bipartisan legislation requiring him to force a divestment of TikTok from its Chinese parent company, a direct challenge to the separation of powers in the legislative process. He's deported lawful U.S. residents without due process, in some cases sending them to countries where their lives are in grave danger. He's targeted activists and institutions for exercising their rights to free speech and academic freedom. These are not small matters. They are bright red constitutional lines that no president, regardless of party, should be permitted to cross. Congressman Carter has had nothing to say on the subject. One searches in vain on his website and social media feeds, in his public appearances and newsletters, for a word of dissent or even disquiet. When he speaks at all, which seems increasingly rare, he focuses elsewhere. On April 14th, for example, Carter said nothing about President Trump's suggestion in a joint press conference with El Salvador President Nayib Bukele that perhaps American citizens should be sent off to prison in El Salvador. That same day, Carter issued a press release touting proposed legislation to address a shortage of bus drivers in America. If he truly cared about the rule of law and the balance of powers, he would speak out when anyone, Republican or Democrat, undermines them. Instead, he reserves his outrage for moments of partisan opportunity. He cries constitutional foul when it suits him and shrugs when the violations come from within his own political tribe. As Thomas Jefferson once put it in a line that Carter quotes on his own website, quote, "When governments fear the people, there is liberty. When people fear the government, there is tyranny," end quote. Carter may wrap himself in the Constitution, but he cannot claim to honor it while turning a blind eye to the fear that the administration is instilling in the people. So that's some of the op-ed. After that ran, Jess got an email from Caitlin Rourke, who at the time of our interview was planning to run as a Democratic candidate for Congress in Carter's district in the 31st. Since our interview, this is just relevant to understanding kind of the things we're talking about, she's now shifted her candidacy to Texas's 10th congressional district for a complicated set of reasons, but mostly they have to do with court rulings, various court rulings on redistricting in Texas. So the 10th is an open seat, which actually goes into Austin. It's an open seat that's left by the impending retirement of Republican Michael McCaul. And like Carter's seat, it's a pretty heavily Republican one, which in a normal election year would safely go to the Republicans by 10 or 12 or 14 points. So though Rourke is no longer challenging Carter, the issues and the kind of challenge remain kind of entirely germane. I don't think any of it changes. We don't actually talk about Carter in much specificity. So after Caitlin reached out to Jess, just to talk about maybe supporting her campaign, so on, just kind of wanting to connect, I asked her to come on my podcast, I think for the same reason that Jess wrote the op-ed in the first place, which is I wanted to feel like I was doing something, or at least think about how one would do something in the very concrete electoral realm. Even if she wins Democratic primary and then loses to whoever the Republican candidate is, I think having a vigorous challenge is meaningful. A smaller loss than what would occur in a typical election year is a signal to Republicans that Trump is dragging them down. An energetic campaign is an end in itself, I think, in a democratic sense. It gets people involved. It brings them into the process. It teaches them, it educates them in how to be part of the process and if necessary, how to resist policies they don't like or even unconstitutional actions from the government. It provides information that can be useful down the line about what kinds of attacks or policies work or don't. It can put the opposition on the defensive in ways that are useful. And I think this is important too, even if it's just psychological. I think it wards off despair in the people who are involved in it. So Caitlin and I talk about all that. We talk about a little bit about her military service. We talk about why she chose to run and kind of how she made that decision. And mostly what it's like to just kind of run in a district like this one, so without national party backing. And then what that means for Caitlin in terms of running her campaign, thinking about how to brand herself, thinking about how to potentially reach out to voters who feel alienated or overlooked, how to kind of finesse, energize in the Democratic base while reaching out to people who may not be traditional Democrats or maybe were Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump voters or something like that. And just, and thinking about what risks to take and what that might look like and how to align that with who you are as a person, who you want to be as a candidate. So it's an interesting conversation, maybe a little different than the kind that I usually do, less about the intellectual scene than about the political scene. But hope you enjoy. Peace. Caitlin Rourke, welcome to Eminent Americans. I hereby anoint you an eminent American by the power vested in me by the 31st Congressional District, which you're running to represent. How did you make the decision to run? Like, however you want to tell that story. So right now you're running you've announced your candidacy for the Democratic primary. The ultimate goal is to go up against the Republican candidate, who we assume will be John Carter, who's represented the district for a while, though I guess he has to, in theory, has to win a primary contest as well. Is that all right, basically?
That is all correct. You were a Texas 31 expert. I'm happy to talk through my calculation and what drove me to run, but you're absolutely right. I'm in a competitive primary, which I think we're seeing in more and more of these red to blue districts in Texas, because I think people are seeing the opportunity and getting really excited about 2026. As far as we know, John Carter, who has been serving in the seat since it was created in 2003, so for 22 years, he has every intention to run again. He is 83, about to be 84, has a much more significant war chest than any of the other competitors in the Republican side. And frankly, he's voted in line with President Trump so consistently that I think he's not at all worried about being challenged by a legitimate primary challenger or having money come into this race, at least on the Republican side. But we are kind of full steam ahead, assuming that he will be our opponent in 2026.
So are there other announced candidates on the Democratic side?
There are 3 gentlemen who are running. There's one gentleman who ran last year, lost in the general election, but obviously won the primary. He got in a little bit late last year, but he's running again. And then 2 other gentlemen who are new to politics as well and have never run for elected office before. So I think it's kind of representative of what happens in some of these seats where you're not hand selected by the party and the party's not paying attention and kind of vetting people and saying, you've got this great profile, go. We have this big donor network that we're going to give you access to. It's a lot of, I would say, bootstrapping candidates in the primary, but it makes it really challenging because we need so much money, an inordinate amount of money, right, and resources and people committed to us starting now to win the general, that it's challenging because now in March we have to go up against each other. Hopefully there'll be a clear winner so we don't have to do a runoff, and then we're spending a lot of money and time and manpower on this primary, and it's hard. It makes the general a much harder equation for us.
You bring up an interesting point, which is there's no party anointed candidate. And the reason for that, I assume, is there are other districts where, the typical spread between the Republican and the Democrat is narrower. And so that until there's evidence to the contrary, they're going to assume, the national party, that it's not a race worth spending money on. Is that right? Is that basically the lay of the land?
I think that's a good assessment. I've learned a lot as I've gone, as somebody who is a bit of a Luddite when it comes to politics. And I didn't know that much about how the parties work and really the races that they take attention to. So a race like this, I've made contact with the DCCC. I've had conversations with a lot of the national advocacy organizations that do endorsements and things like that. But yeah, this is not one that's on their radar. And I mean, they're aware of it, but it's not something that they see as a winnable race. I will say the DCCC is, I think, bringing in more staff to focus on some of those second tier races, because I think they've seen in so many instances things change so quickly where all of a sudden you get a candidate for instance, in this district in 2018, MJ Hagar ran. And for my own comfort, I often look at her financials. And, she was just a pretty traditional candidate up until about June of 2018, of the election year, of the general election year. And she didn't raise all this money until she did that viral ad. And then that sort of gave her that national profile where people started paying attention, and it became this swing race, and it kind of elevated in prominence on the national scale. But up until then, she was raising tens of thousands of dollars each quarter, which is pretty standard for races like this. But it's a grind. Yeah. I mean, it is very much a bootstrap, do what you can, be gritty, be scrappy, not have a bunch of fancy people focusing on you. And so that's very much, I think, where our race. And I think there's a number of them. I do think I would say that the donor populations are also probably significant with this, because you look at some of the other races where maybe, I mean, even there's a race in New York, and I'm blanking on the race, but it's a competitive primary. It's like a D+6 race or something, but there's a Republican in the seat. So of course, I mean, races like that, it's incomparable, right? And so people hear about my budget or my fundraising, and they come from those races, and they're like, what? But Texas seems to have its own unique breed of scrappy primaries and scrappy candidates. And then once you hit that tipping point where you start having these factors like an incumbent, an aging incumbent, 2026, all these different factors, maybe some really interesting people at the top of the ticket, and that all that goodness kind of comes down. But for these next few months, it's definitely just being in the trenches and battling it out with the other primary candidates.
So I think a lot of what I want to talk to you about is kind of in that space of like what that looks like, sort of trying to emerge from a crowded field. And then also, we'll say for the sake of argument that you win the primary, kind of how you take on somebody like Carter. But I want to ask first, do you remember when it first occurred to you, like the moment the thought popped into your head, I should run for this seat? Correct me if I'm wrong, you don't have any prior, experience running for office.
I don't. And I think for me, the only thing I can liken it to, I'm a Army veteran, I'm a current reservist, and I felt this immense duty really starting, I mean, going back to like September 11th. I grew up a couple of miles away from the Pentagon, and September 11th was probably one of the most transformative days of my life. I mean, I'll put my wedding and the birth of my children up there somewhere, but September 11th, in terms of setting me on the course that I followed, in terms of what I studied in school, in terms of joining the military, just in terms of even my personal intellectual interests, really set the stage for me. And so when I joined the military, I felt this call to something higher, to wearing the uniform, to serving in the way that one does in the military. And before the election last year, I was paying some attention. I mean, I'm probably in the class of people that listen to podcasts and read a lot of kind of high level media and analysis, but I never considered myself somebody that was out knocking on doors or doing a lot of organizing or advocacy work. I'm still in the military, so I think there's some limitation there too, as far as especially the climate we're in. But I started exploring what would public service look like? What would elected office look like? And I did some work with a really great organization called New Politics. They work with people with service backgrounds. So nurses, Teach for America alumni, civil servants, and of course, a big contingent of that are members of the military. And I did a boot camp with them. It was like a one-day boot camp. And a lot of people walked away, and they gave you just this primer on what does it look like? What are all your hang-ups? It felt like therapy a lot of times, because you had to be really honest about the things that were holding you back. And so for me, once I identified those and got over those mental hurdles, I think I had a lot more clarity that I did want to run for office. And
when was that? What was the timeline? When was that you did the workshop with the New Politics group?
It was in the fall timeframe. I think it was in October 2024.
So just before the election, just before Trump was elected. So you had some notion that this, in some fashion, you might want to involve yourself more in politics.
I'd say less involve myself in politics. I think I was really frustrated at what I was seeing in the Democratic Party. And I think as somebody who had multiple feet in multiple places. So I had a lot of friends who are highly educated, who are Democrats through and through, who oftentimes vote against their economic self-interest to remain Democrats. And they thought, gosh, Kamala Harris is phenomenal, right? She has to win. How could anybody vote for Donald Trump? And I'm going to my military drill, and I'm talking to other friends in other places, especially here in Texas. And there was a very clear disconnect between the messaging and the narrative that I was hearing in one very small and kind of parochial part of my life, and then a much bigger part where people were kind of happy with the way things were going, or were
Yeah.
really excited about Donald Trump, or people who you just wouldn't typically think, oh my gosh, I can't believe that someone's going to vote for Donald Trump. I don't know any Trump voters, right? And I think I started to look at that and started to think, you know, someone with my profile, with my background, with my stamina, I'm young for politics, right? Especially Congress. Could I be the bridge? I mean, is it a
Yeah.
naive thought to think that maybe I could be one of those people that could go and help drive voters to get excited about a candidate and talk and listen to voters in a way that maybe a standard politician who is so beholden to a party label, or wanting to have a long political career, or not wanting to take risks. I felt like I needed to take my energy and channel it in some way. And so when I did that exploration with New Politics, I wasn't sure how that would end up. Would it be running for school board? I mean, they prepare people to run for PTA president. I mean, every level, every echelon of service is important. Or seek out some appointment. Maybe it's a nonprofit board seat. And for me, I was just really drawn to the challenge of Congress. I felt like a little bit of a masochist because I've worked in DC, and I was like, what am I doing? Why am I so drawn to this? But I think increasingly it just felt like I felt a call to apply my energy and my ability to talk to people from every imaginable background with different issue priorities, to be able to talk about those experiences authentically and help them understand how policy issues and the votes that their congressman or congresswoman takes are impacting their daily life. And so that's kind of what set me on the course of running for Congress.
I'm curious, you decide, okay, I think I want to run for Congress. A lot of us have fantasies of that, right? Like if we're interested in politics and we sort of look out and we see the candidates on both sides, whether it's the person from the other party we're hoping to topple or it's the people we might compete against who are running against them. And like, they don't seem that good at it. They don't seem like that good at being politicians in this sort of candidacy sense. Like they're not, like John Carter is not particularly charismatic. You know, it may be that he's like a total whiz at some, I think he was a judge at one point. Like it may be that he's like a total whiz at some sort of organizational aspects of it. But it's not like that's a dude who's out there giving barn burning speeches and like radiating charisma, you know, across the land. Nor does that seem to be the case of like the Democratic politicians who are often running against him. So I think what that instills in a lot of us is a fantasy that like we could do it, right? That we're like, actually, even though it's not necessarily the space that we're coming from, it's achievable. And then at the same time, to actually do it, you have to create this structure and organization that in most cases you have zero knowledge of how to do. And so I'm curious for you, like, what does one do? Go find like a experienced political consultant? Did you talk to somebody who'd run for office before? Like what are the actual mechanics of setting up a real campaign, a real professional campaign for Congress?
Yeah, there's no guidebook. There is a lot of snake oil in the industry. I remember when I first started out, a former congressional candidate who's a friend told me, he used a great term. He called it the political industrial complex, you know, and he's like, and he's an army guy too. So he's like, it's just there's this infrastructure and you sort of have to play by these rules and connect with this person and that person. But I did start from scratch, as did the other gentleman in my primary, where we are building up. We don't have a social media presence. We don't have a persona. We don't have name recognition. So for me, the New Politics stuff helped. I think I also had just some basic professional background, having worked in DC, being a communicator, being someone who's spent time in marketing and public affairs, understanding, I think, how to leverage the veteran community as well. And so the best piece of advice I got was lock in consultants ahead of time. And a lot of these consultants do the TV and the digital work and the mailers and all the things that for a campaign like mine seem wildly unachievable right now because they require so much money and they may or may not move the needle in an election like mine, but they become essentially experts that you have at your disposal. And you don't have to be able to afford them, right? Because they're working and giving you various services throughout the beginning of the campaign with the hope, right? They spread their risk out. So they've got maybe 50 candidates in a cycle, and 5 of them are in a really safe Democratic seat, and they're going to raise a ton of money and they're going to be really lucrative for the firm. And then they have a bunch of people who are maybe less likely to win, but still probably will raise a lot of money and bring good business to the consultancy And then there's people who are sort of real risks and they work with you, they coach you, they give you advice. And it's helpful, at least at those beginning stages, because you can at least, everyone sort of has different opinions, but you start hearing consistent advice. And then it would sort of trigger for me like, okay, that's probably what I need to be doing. So that helped a lot.
Did you have to sell yourself to them? Is that in that situation? Like I don't know which of those, you're not in the safe Democratic seat. I don't know if you're in the in the middle category or the long shot category, but did you have to, if you wanted to get one of the good consultants, did you have to sort of essentially pitch yourself to them and persuade them that you were, a risk, but a good risk to take in that they're going to take some?
I thought I would need to sell myself. My first thought was, why would anybody want, especially having worked in a profit generating business? I'm like, why would you want to work for somebody who may not be able to fundraise, may not be able to afford your services? But I didn't. They were, I think a lot of them also look at the long game because, again, a lot of people get into politics with the intention. I mean, very few people win their first race, right? I mean, a lot
Right,
of prominent
right.
politicians have run for office multiple times. They build up a donor base. It is a long game for them. And so they are trying to, I think there was, sometimes it's the race, sometimes it's a candidate. I think in my case, not to pat myself on the back, but I think it was me as a candidate, being a mom, being a female veteran, having the basic understanding of how certain things work, being able to be really independent, being, they were able to see, okay, she's engaging on the phone so she can fundraise. I mean, all these things, I think they connect their dots. So I think there was a screening involved, but it was less me trying to twist their arm to come work for my campaign. So once I got that slate in place, it helped a lot. And then I did hire a launch manager who came through. I just reached out to a lot of different people and her name came to me, and she had worked on some big races in Texas and had just started her own consultancy. So it worked out really well to have her come on board, and she kind of showed me the ropes. But I think the one thing that I've discovered in this is, if hindsight's 2020 and I can look back, is I think the one thing I was missing early on was I recognized this was a really hard race, as are so many of these red to blue races in Texas and across the country. But I think that I realized that there's sort of different, I almost feel like we need a guide, and maybe a new politics or a run for something, or one of these organizations can create it. But there are different categories of campaign. And I think mine fell into the not on anyone's radar. Most of the donors I'm calling don't live in the district, so I'm not going to represent them. And our ability to fundraise, unless again you're independently wealthy, you have just an incredible donor base that's willing to be that friends and family seed money, you don't fall into that. So what's your playbook look like? How do you win the primary without these traditional tactics that are like, you got to do this, you got to do this? Well, where's that money coming from? So I think that is one of the things that I've learned pretty quickly. And I think that one of the frustrations that I'm sure a lot of candidates have, and I've talked to candidates who have been in these races before, is that they don't really have the full sight picture of when someone says this is going to be hard. They assume that it's going to follow like a pretty predictable trajectory, and it just doesn't. It usually goes totally off the rails, and you have to recover from that. So that's been the one kind of piece I think I wanted to build, this very sophisticated, well-functioning team with experts on it, and I did. But I think what I underestimated and what I'm learning, and I think all of my fellow primary members are learning, is just this is a really challenging district, especially when you don't have the attention of a lot of the national organizations, definitely of the party, not the state party. You're kind of on your own, and you sort of have to, I think, create your own playbook that's going to work for you and what your strengths are.
Well, yeah, I mean, let's get into that a little bit, because I'm thinking about the ways, like, in lots of districts for lots of different kinds of races, often it's like the local party that kind of anoints somebody. And so there's a kind of existing structure and pathway to success in the primaries. I'm just thinking about the primaries right now, right? So that's one scenario. Like another scenario is, like you said, it's self-funded, you're independently wealthy. Maybe you can just spend so much money that you can raise enough name awareness. It's hard to get name awareness in a primary, right? Particularly in a primary where like people don't expect you to win, don't expect somebody from your party to win. So like if you had enough money, you could do it that way. It's like, how do you even think about it? Up until, whatever, a few months ago when you announced your candidacy, I mean, you're an impressive person, but you're functionally anonymous, right? How would you get people to pay attention to you? Like, what is the game plan for something like that?
I think that the easiest is, to your point, the easy button of a big digital spend, a TV spend, all these traditional tactics. And I think what I've learned in this, and I think what I would encourage any other candidates to do, is when I first started out, I was really focused on and I remain very focused on viability. I've never been like a Texas Democrat, right? Where I am entrenched in these campaigns and I live and die for them. And so for me, I'm like, well, we got to win, right? We're not going to obviously sacrifice our principles and our values to do that, but let's focus on winning. How do we win here? And I think that what I've learned in the experience is there's sort of this way of doing things, and then there's something that's unique to each candidate that maybe gives them an advantage. And so I'm thinking through that. I'm trying to figure out what that looks like for me. But I think that leaning in for me to the professional background that I have as a communicator, as a marketer, I've had a lot of people say, well, don't take your MBA and try to apply that to politics because it doesn't work. But ultimately, I mean, there's a lot of parallels and similarities between acquiring a customer, right? Having the first touch point. I mean, these basics of like the marketing funnel or comms, right? And having, I mean, if you've studied like influence, right? Or if you've studied any sort of basics of communications, or I think about in the military, a lot of things that I studied and trained on. I think I'm starting to take the traditional playbook that I've been given and say, this doesn't work. It clearly doesn't work here because we keep losing. I mean, so let's do something differently. And I think part of that is making different arguments than a lot of people are making, having different messages, and engaging with just strange bedfellows, right? Because a lot of people have differing opinions. Some of my primary opponents and I think, differ on how to appeal to voters. We were at a candidate forum maybe 2 weeks ago, and two people mentioned needing to make the tent smaller, right? The proverbial tent needs to be smaller. And I'm like, well, then the math doesn't work because we lost by 102,000 votes in 2024 in this district. So there's like a math problem here. And I think that for me, I'm coming from a place of being at a deficit, right? Like we lost. I mean, every district is winnable, right? But in terms of if you just take like the betting odds, right, it's not winnable. And so I think being able to take that and put it on a shelf and focus on tactics that are different, messages that are different, ways of engaging people and reaching people that are different. I think that is something that regardless of the outcome, I can look at myself in the mirror and be like, we tried something different, and we found maybe a new way to communicate with people and to help people rethink what a Democrat looks like and what democratic messaging looks like. But it's tough, and I think everybody has to contend with that because there's ways to do it, but oftentimes we spend oodles of money on things, and I mean, we still end up falling short. And again, back to that political industrial complex, I think I've seen that I'm glad that the money I do have is going to keep people employed, some really, really smart, driven, mission and values driven people. But ultimately, I think we are treating campaigns not enough like business, right? Where there's a focus more on if winning is the ultimate goal here, if you're investing your money into a campaign with the hope that X, Y, and Z happen, how do you increase your chances of that happening? And I think that's where I have a little bit of a disconnect with some of the maybe thinking and academic thinking on politics. And so I've been trying to lean into that instead of before where I think I thought, I'm not the expert here. Am I being naive to think this? And now I'm thinking like, no, I think we just have to try things differently because clearly we're in a position to take risks. So let's take risk. And I think it's been really resonating with the folks that I've been talking to, especially on the viability and the put forward a candidate that can actually win and don't subject people to these purity tests that maybe don't work in districts like mine. But I think it's also where we can having the ability to reach people with those messages that resonate. So I think something that I am able to do is, for instance, after the voucher fights, there are a lot of pissed off moms in Texas, right? Not to say dads aren't pissed off, but there were a lot of women who volunteered and spoke and were just outraged. And they're starting to see the impacts in their schools. They're seeing school closures. They're sort of getting this, especially people who moved here during COVID, right? And weren't really familiar with Texas. And they're like, man, Texas education is a mess. And how do you go and how do you awaken something in them to get them excited about me as a candidate? How do you get people excited about these races that I think feel so abstract sometimes to them? Like my vote either doesn't matter or I'm hearing the same platitudes over and over from candidates. It's being able to be just direct. And ultimately, I think you're trying to convince people that you're the right person for the job. I think most Democrats are going to be pretty aligned on policy. I think any freshman congressman woman is not going to go in and move mountains and shouldn't overpromise things, right? So I think it's really just, I hate to say like it's a vibes thing, but ultimately it is. It's a tryout to say, does this person seem like a person of character, a person who has the ability to also, win this election, and somebody who I can see going and talking to my neighbors who don't maybe agree with me, right? And I think being able to convey that requires you to come in at different levels than just a mailer, right? Great to be able to do that. Great to be able to do a digital buy. I mean, it's easy. You write a check and you do some ad copy and you're done for the day. But it takes, I think, the ability to go out and connect with people in different communities. And also, I don't buy into the idea that if someone's never voted in a Democratic primary, that they won't vote or that they're not worth going after. I think there's a lot of thinking that you should really only go after people who are sort of reliable voters. But there's a variety of factors where maybe somebody couldn't vote, or somebody was really frustrated with the nominee at the time, or they felt like, gosh, no, none of these primary candidates excite me and I don't want to vote for them. So I think it's also just going and finding who those people are. I mean, relational organizing to me is, it is the only way that we do in a cost-effective way of having that kind of nucleus of a person who's then able to just build your movement and do a lot of the work for you of telling your own story and telling them why they're excited about me as a candidate, and just kind of growing that movement, I think, in a truly like kitchen table kind of way.
Yeah. So, I mean, flesh that out for me, like relational organizing, like you're thinking about, the issue like the voucher fight or something like that. So you have this insight or observation that there is a sort of potential group of people who can be mobilized around this issue. So is the strategy for you primarily like crafting flyers or other kinds of mass marketing things that sort of hit that message? Or is it like specifically reaching out to like, Mary Smith, who testified at this hearing or something like that, and trying to get her to be a sort of super motivated volunteer for your campaign? Like, I actually don't know. I mean, I can guess what relational organizing means in some general sense, but is that, what does that mean in sort of in practice? Is that like you like like in the way that you reached out to my wife after she wrote, an op-ed criticizing Carter? Like, is it just like looking for people who then can kind of ramify beyond themselves because they become motivated sort of volunteers or advocates for your campaign? Or is it mass messaging?
Again, mass messaging is probably the most, I don't want to say effective, but it's the most efficient way to reach people, no question.
Yeah. Yep.
In the absence of the ability to do that, I think that the way to reach those people is that individual outreach. I think it's finding who are those champions, who are those advocates. And a lot of people feel really helpless, right? Especially after the last session. It's just people are frustrated and they want to channel that rage, that need to help kind of continue the momentum that they felt in the last legislative session. And sometimes elections can feel like a hard place to do that, right? Because there's not something tangible, on the table. And so for me, I actually left my full-time job at the end of August. So I have a lot of time right now, and I have a lot of the ability to reach out to those people. And I find those are just much more compelling spokespeople and much more compelling advocates for my campaign than me trying to go out and reach 200 people. There's the ability of finding people in those communities who are just those connectors. They're just those people that are deeply passionate about issues and who can mobilize people and bring people to hear about someone like me, hear about other candidates, hear about other issues and initiatives. And again, I think that there are some really sophisticated mobilization and organizing programs and volunteer programs, and there's this blueprint for how to do organizing, but oftentimes it doesn't survive first contact because you need a great person running that plan and you need resources and all these things. So I think for me, there's like again, I keep using bootstrapping, but I think it is that individual outreach. And I think we see that those movements sort of blossom in a big way. I started this listening tour a few weeks ago, and I try to visit, different places in the district, but have formal sit down conversations with voters. And I mean, when you ask, people want to help. And then it sort of multiplies. Now, is that at the scale that you need to win a primary? I don't know. There's also traditional Democrats that go to Democratic clubs that are very highly engaged, either donors or people who are very active in these clubs or some of these Democratic aligned clubs like Indivisible and things like that. But then there's also people that I think are have nothing holding them back from going and voting for in a Democratic primary. I think a lot of them want to be more politically engaged. I think they find the whole thing just so disconcerting. And so I think when you're able to sort of inject some hope and get them excited about you as a candidate. And the other day someone shared they were introducing me at an event, and she was biased, but she said it was talking to a group of moms, and she's like, we need somebody who isn't just going to offer, hope and prayers after the next Uvalde. And a moment like that where somebody can actually think this person could actually go and she could do this thing, right? You get them believing that you are the person that should go serve them and can maybe make some difference, because the alternative is the status quo and the same, business as usual. And I think that's the point where being able to reach those people. But to your point, it's unanswered for me. It's the tactical execution of that remains unanswered, but I think I'm really excited to do things a little differently and just experiment and throw some stuff at the wall and, kind of throw out the traditional playbook because it's not working. So we'll see. I'll report back in a couple of months once I've executed.
So in the primary, what's the message? What are you pitching to Democratic primary voters that you are the person best positioned to defeat John Carter compared to your rivals?
When you hear me and the other primary contenders, and I think this goes for many primaries, a lot of people have similar issues, right? I mean, we're all championing a lot of hallmark Democratic policies, right? We all care about affordable health care and accessible childcare and, infrastructure improvements. But to me, it's really, is this individual best equipped to be the fighter in the primary that we need? And are they viable, right? Both from fundraising standpoint. I kind of rolled my eyes when I first heard about fundraising because I was like, how much does this really matter? But it's a heuristic that really matters to a lot of the national organizations, a lot of the local kind of influential Democratic folks. Now, do I think that there have been candidates that have made a big mistake by just focusing exclusively on raising money instead of being in the district and actually talking to voters? Absolutely. But I think there's a way to sort of balance the two to show that you're the viable candidate. Because again, people know that to win traditional voters and get independents engaged and get disengaged, like low information voters engaged, you need to rely more on those traditional tactics. And that requires money and resources. And I think it's sort of a tryout to show, are you able to raise that money? Are you focused on the long game? I've invested a lot in digital fundraising, those annoying texts and emails that everybody gets. And at first I was like, why are we doing this? Everybody hates getting these. But I've converted a lot of those people into, I go to events and they say, I donated to your campaign, and I love getting your emails because, the messages you're sharing in there are so different than what other emails and texts sound like when I get them. And even when I make phone calls to donors, they sound different. So I think it's just distinguishing yourself.
Wait, so how are they different? Tell me how they're different. Tell me how they're different. You can go left, you can go center. It could be more that you're trying to sell yourself as somebody who has an unusual amount of charisma. What's your pitch?
I think it's two things. I think one thing, I've come out really hard against Carter. I've also come out against one of the primary challengers on the Republican side who doesn't seem very viable. She hasn't raised a lot, but she's this woman named Valentina Gomez, and she's got this big national profile. She's very inflammatory, very hateful. I mean, she burned a Koran last week with a flamethrower and posted a video, and just, one of those people that I think deserves attention, and I am ready to call her out. And so I think being able to show people that I'm ready to take on a John Carter and hold him accountable and be the kind of candidate. Now, is he ever going to come debate me or do any event with me? Absolutely not. But am I somebody who can apply that pressure to him? That I think is something that is really important, and I want to just continue ramping up to just show that I've got the fight in me. And I think also just leveling with people. I think the pros, and I think just the style of the emails too is really different. In the text, I try not to have the typical, my team is like, you got to do these countdown emails and we need 54 donors by midnight to meet. I was like, we're absolutely not doing that, because A, it's disingenuous, and B, everybody's getting this stuff, as opposed to just leveling with people. I have some stuff coming out next week, and it's basically saying, I'm not a handpicked candidate. I don't have the donor base. I am truly relying on this stuff, not to go pay big bills, but to keep my operational costs paid for this month, and I think just being real with people and raw and myself and authentic. And I think that has made a really big difference. I try not to the Jimmy Kimmel stuff, right? I didn't have a terribly strong opinion about it in the sense that I didn't feel like I needed to jump in and offer my own commentary because to your point earlier, no one knows who I am and nobody cares what I have to say. But when, Trump started mobilizing the National Guard in cities, or I'm going to post something, with government shutdowns because I've worked in Washington during government shutdowns. And those are like just things that I get pretty passionate about instead of just trying to stick with kind of the usual, this is what we need to do as a Democrat. And this is, I'm going to fight for this and I'm going to do that. Well, everyone's going to, right? I'm citing the same studies and figures. And I think people want to see that you're a fighter. And I think people also want to see that you have the ability to, again, kind of a tryout of like, can you go connect with my parents who watch Fox News religiously, but privately have shared that they're not that big of a fan of Donald Trump. Can you go and convince them not to necessarily vote for you, but can you even have a conversation with them? Can you be that person who kind of bridges that divide? So I try not to be like, am I moderate? Am I progressive? I try to really focus more on just giving people a chance to get to know me better and understand my why and have more information than they typically would to assess whether they think I stand a chance to beat this guy in November of next year.
You mentioned it at some forum that some of the other primary candidates had sort of talked about, narrowing the tent, making the tent smaller. I guess what I took from that, but you can correct this, is there's just this question, and this would be in the general election, this isn't in the primary, win over people who haven't voted for you in the past versus rev up the base and kind of win a base turnout election. Was that the kind of divide there that you think you're gonna have to win some people over who have voted for John Carter in the past and presumably Donald Trump, and they're saying, no, that's not the path is to just like massively energize the Democratic Party base who's mad at the Republicans, and that's the path to victory. Is that the divide, or is it a different one?
No, I think it is. And I don't think it's a question of one or the other. I think you can do both simultaneously. And I think Democrats, especially like battle tested Democrats in red districts, know the game. They understand that we cannot go talk about certain issues or social issues or some of these really sensitive topics that you can go do in a D+25 district. We just can't. And so I think they're very pragmatic in that sense. And when I think about it, again, back to winning, we don't have a big enough Democratic base to win the election. So we have to bring some people under the tent. We have to bring some new people in. We have to bring, and again, not everyone votes in an election. There's some people who are just never going to get off the couch and vote. But I think it's when we don't talk to people and meet them where they are and have just real candid talk about things, they're not that inspired. They haven't been that inspired by candidates. Now, the exception, of course, was MJ Hagar in 2018. I mean, she came within 2.5 points of John Carter, which was just stunning. And he was 10 years younger. And, the 18 election was probably similar to what a lot of people are predicting for 2026. But still, I mean, she was able to engage people who had traditionally never voted. She got people really excited. She got veterans excited. She got working moms excited, all these people that kind of fit, in her profile and were really motivated by her. And so I think that she, to me, is the example of, she had a math problem and she had to overcome it. And she got really, really close to doing that. But I just don't know how you can. I mean, I think James Tallarico is an example with what he's doing. I think there's this feeling, and the reason people feel, I think, really excited about him is all of a sudden they're like, you've got a lot of people who maybe have a problem disconnecting their religious identity with their political identity. So all of a sudden you're giving them this new option to say, well, what if you support someone who can debate toe to toe with a Republican lawmaker about scripture and the Bible and religious issues, and he's a Democrat, right? And so I think that the idea is you're widening that pool of people who could be likely voters and are also pragmatic at the end of the day. They just don't. I don't think I don't think a lot of Democrats have done the hard work to disconnect the D next to their name or make the D next to their name more than just, here's the national party. It's what does it mean to be a Democrat or a Democratic congresswoman in Texas 31? What does that mean? And making it tangible. And I think the inability to do that alienates a lot of people because they just assume you're, the henchman for Chuck Schumer. And they've never been told, and the onus is on us to do that, how we are going to serve them and deliver in a way that someone like John Carter didn't.
what brought MJ Hagar to national attention was an ad she did that kind of went viral. Is that right? And what was that ad?
Yeah, it was this ad called Doors. It's just a remarkable ad. It's I mean, just the whole concept. But she basically it starts off, I think she was a medevac helicopter pilot and was shot down, sustained injuries from that. It's like a door that of her helicopter, and then it leads into a door at her house when she's a kid, and her mom is like fleeing domestic violence, and it's a really masterful ad. But I think it also starts, it's a picture of her or video footage of her with her family at the dinner table, her young kids, and her in combat, and her at the Pentagon advocating for women to be able to serve in combat roles. So it would just so masterfully took her entire history and just packed it into an ad. And after she did that ad, I mean, that just catapulted her campaign into new territory. I think she raised over $5 million just for that campaign, which for a congressional campaign in Texas 31 is just truly unheard of. So it's an incredible ad. And I think it's also a reminder of, to your point, not everybody's going to have an ad like that that's going to catch fire. For the other 99% of candidates, you're not going to be so fortunate to have that happen. So taking her playbook and being like, well, what can we do? Take away a lot of the really expensive stuff, but what can have an impact in the way that she had an impact without that level of budget? And I think we don't often ask ourselves that. We're sort of constrained by, this is the gold standard. If you can't reach that, it's going to be really hard to get there, instead of looking and saying, well, there's some examples of races where we flipped seats before and we've done it because of a really compelling candidate or just environmental factors that have made it a little bit easier for us.
There is a scenario where 2026 is just one of these, it's a blue wave election or something like that. Like there's a huge reaction to Donald Trump, to the administration, to the Republican Congress. And so then the Democrats win all sorts of seats that were sort of thought to be safe. And there's plenty of examples of that, right, historically. And then you don't have to be an MJ. You don't have to have the viral ad. You don't have to be Zohran Mamdani. You don't have to be Barack Obama, right? You have to be like the right person in the right place who's like a good candidate, but you don't have to take huge swings, right? You have to run a good campaign and then you benefit from context. So that's one scenario. I guess the question is just like, how much of a gamble are you going to take? Because I think it's like, my guess is, and this is purely just sort of my gut sense, is like, if it doesn't turn out to be one of those elections, right, then in order for you to win this thing, you'd have to take some big swings, whether it's some like amazing ad or, I mean, another thing, I mean, I sense that you don't want to like get involved in this sort of ideological, or sort of intra-partisan conflict, maybe. But it's like one strategy that I'm sure some Democrats will adopt, they've adopted already, is this sort of punching left strategy, right? There's like, I'm thinking of somebody like Richie Torres in New York or something like that, or John Fetterman's doing something like that, where they're like, Americans don't like woke Democrats. They're sick of, school marm Democrats telling them what to do, telling them their kids have to wear masks, that schools have to be closed down, that trans rights have to be as expansive as possible. And we're going to not just like what you were saying, which is kind of like downplay those culture war issues. We're actually going to like put a stake in the ground and say, we are a Democrat. We believe in X, Y, and Z, but we're not one of those Democrats, right? Like, I think Richie Torres or maybe it was Ruben Gallego, one of the Latino candidates was like, when I hear somebody say the word Latinx, like it just makes my skin crawl, right? And that was like a line in the sand. Like, I am not like those other Democrats, right? And so I guess I'm sort of curious, are you running campaign A where you're going to count on a historic wave election to carry you into office if you run a solid campaign? Or do you think you're going to like swing for the fences and try and win in a year when like maybe the context favors you somewhat, maybe it makes up a few of the points, but the rest of it you have to make up by being a sort of unusual, riskier candidate?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's something I've thought a lot about. And we have this quote, this Dr. Seuss quote we tell our kids, and it's what is it? Today you are you, that is truer than true. There's no one alive that is youer than you. And I think it's easy to say, oh, you're MJ or you're Mamdani, or I'm Caitlin Rourke and I am who I am and I have the strengths that I have and I am authentically myself. And so anything that I do, there's risk, but it's risk that I'm willing to take because it's true to who I am. I'm not going to be somebody who's going to go out and, berate someone or go off on a totally inappropriate tangent. But I do think that I can convey, because I'm frustrated with the systems, I'm frustrated with the state of things, I can convey that in a way that is authentic to me. And so I think I don't want to be overly prescriptive about the path I'm going to take. I don't think that most people are in this district in particular want you to necessarily go after Democrats. I think they're just frustrated across the board. And I think they want to hear about issues where they feel validated. People just want to be heard. People just want you to listen to them and feel like you are, and it's not just go talk to my aide right there and they'll help you out. They want to just they're having access to somebody who's running for Congress. Even though I am right now somebody who's got a lot of time to devote to this and who's all in on my campaign, there's a feeling for me, of wanting to be myself and be a Democrat, but also speak to the issues that really keep people up at night and concern people. And some of those, I think, have been these taboo, off limits issues, border security, right? Crime and safety. And those are issues that I can talk about really authentically because I've served in the Texas Army National Guard. I've, supported border missions. My husband does part-time EMT work and is considered a first responder. And I'm not afraid to go into that territory that's off limits and taboo. And I think in a place like this, that's what you have to do. You have to have the courage to take risk. So I think that in other places, I think when you're maybe in a more heated Democratic race, you maybe can go and say, look, I'm going to go after our party. I think because I'm not part of the party and I'm not part of the establishment and I have no name ID and I'm not doing this to increase my name ID. I'm doing this because I wanted to run for an election where I thought I would better serve people and everybody, not just a small part of a congressional district in Congress. I'm not afraid to take risk. My risk appetite is very high, but I think you don't have to do things that are just trying to draw attention to yourself. Now, I have thought about, and I would love your take on it as a communicator and someone who does, media relations and PR. I've thought a lot about when I first started out, I talked to this PR firm. They're like a national PR firm. And everyone said, you shouldn't do national PR. You shouldn't, you don't have the budget for it. And it's just too early. And again, you're just a kind of nobody candidate in a race that not a lot of people are paying attention to. But I think as I've gone down and I've tried to trust, I've really leaned into my own instincts instead of just following kind of the usual advice. I think there's something to be said for stirring up that just frustration with the system. And we've seen examples, you hear people, and there's enough examples. I mean, again, we've got a lot of voters, right? And so you do have to rely on data. It can't just be individual onesie, twosie conversations and anecdotes. But in general, I think that people are just frustrated and fed up. And I think when you're beholden to these talking points and you're beholden to saying certain things and sounding so polished and politician-y, people hate it, right? So I think that when you can just be yourself, you've kind of got one shot at it. I mean, if you're going to do this over and over, maybe it changes because you start developing a persona and you have to act a certain way. But I feel like I'm very invigorated by just being a new candidate and being able to kind of do the things that guide me and also being flexible and nimble in all this because things may change, right? I may see an opportunity from a national media standpoint where I can get together some other candidates across Texas or across the country who are running similarly to what I'm doing and say, we have a story to tell. We want voters to understand, that there are people out there that are doing this and aren't part of the establishment and shouldn't get kind of swept up in the big D Democratic Party. And we have a different message and we're trying to reset here. We're trying to bring more normal people into Congress, not career politicians, people who are living what working families are going through every day, what business owners are going through every day into Congress. But to do that, we may need to change our opinions a little bit about who can be electable to Congress. So I think I've thought a lot about that, but I think as long as I can look at myself in the mirror every night and be like, yeah, I was myself today and didn't try to pander, I feel pretty good about what we're going to do.
I think you're right that like being yourself and sort of seeming authentic is at the heart of it. And different candidates emanate that in different ways. I mean, Donald Trump, for all that I kind of loathe the man and for how little I think of him, he does broadcast a certain kind of authenticity, right? He's like whatever dysfunctional, toxic narcissist he is, that's how he comes across, right? And like the great candidates do that, and it looks different depending on them. I think the part of it, one of the ways when I'm thinking about risk for any candidate is like, well, yes, it's authentic, but it's authentic. It's an exaggeration or a distillation of your authenticity, right? Like the average person's authenticity is not big enough to like become a successful politician, I guess, is my instinct. So it's like politicians like pop singers or celebrities or, writers or something like that. It's like you take who you are and then you craft it and you distill it for sort of maximal rhetorical effect. I think that's where like these questions come in about how to present yourself to the world. It's not an inauthentic thing. It's just like politicians are performers, right? And sort of if I were running against John Carter and you're talking about fighting, like, and this would be authentic to me, but not necessarily to you. It's like a big billboard that's like, John, why does John Carter suck so much? Like, go to this URL. Like there is saying John Carter is not representing the interests of the 31st district is kind of generic speak, right? Like saying John Carter sucks and find out why, that's not a typical. I'm not saying you have to do that, but I'm just saying like it would seem to me the challenge for you would be, or if you're pitching yourself to the media, like if you're talking about putting together a network of candidates who kind of have a similar profile, well, you have to brand that somehow, right? I mean, this is work you've done, right? What is the brand? What are you? What distinguishes you? And hands a sort of gift wraps a story hook to a journalist to write about these, like, whatever they are, veteran moms or anti-woke Democrats or whatever, like whatever the brand is, you need to define it, right, in a way that's like constructed, but I don't think that necessarily means inauthentic, right? So what parts of you are you gonna distill and elevate?
You're absolutely right. And I think and I think the other issue, right, the overlay here is, and what you're pointing to is, I think things that are cheekier, things that are more attention grabbing. But I think that when you talk to people, especially somebody who's an independent or maybe a Republican who doesn't like Trump, there are a lot of people who are just, they think Donald Trump's doing a great job. They like him. They take him for all his faults and idiosyncrasies. But a lot of people say, he's not presidential. It doesn't feel like there's also this air of what someone perceives a congressman or congresswoman to look like. And I think that has everything to do with how you carry yourself, how you speak, how you look, how you dress, the clothes that you wear. And I think that is where there's a way to distinguish yourself a bit, because I think you can sound cardboardish, right? You can sound, and if you're in a safe Democratic or Republican district, those people sit there for a really long time. And this is my congressman, right? He's been here for decades, or this person is then going on to higher office. I mean, things just sound really scripted. They sound very, and especially when you're in less safe audiences. When you're just with your own folks, maybe you can be a little more, you can be a little more gregarious. But when they're talking to kind of a general audience, it's very staged. It's very rehearsed. You can tell they've looked at their talking points and memorized them, and they've done their stump speech. And I can't tell you the number of people that I've said when I go out and I'll talk. I mean, I was at a candidate forum and we were supposed to do a stump speech, and I kind of went off script, and I had a few people come up and they're like, it was so refreshing. It was such a breath of fresh air that you just said something different, right? It wasn't, telling a story to hook people and then going into the, my background and why I'm running and all, and it's like people hear that all the time. And I think that's where I'm getting at, is like is it about being cheeky? Is it about being different? I think it's more about just doing things that are catch people a little off guard, but because you're not doing the norm, right? It's not doing anything super controversial, some big stunt, but I think it's just sounding and looking and giving real, raw, candid anecdotes that aren't like, you read any like self-help book, right? And it's like a quote, an anecdote. My client said this, and they like some made up anecdote that supports the point that you're making. I mean, same with speech writing, right? People, I think, are just hungry for something different. And I think social media, I think the way we consume information, I think all of that has also reshaped how people think. And I don't think we have really shifted from how we deliver talking points to how we deliver speeches. I mean, a lot of it's like, you want to get a sound bite, right, that then you can kind of repost and repurpose for social media or for other content purposes. But I think in general, people are just hungry for something different and realness and rawness. And when I bring my kids to events, they're thrilled, because it's like me being like, okay, hold on a second, like, please stop talking, or like, I'm bribing you with sugar, or, tonight I have an event that I'm doing, like a virtual town hall. And I mean, I had to ask the organizer. I was like, I need to know, is this end at 8:30 or 8? Because there are going to be a lot of questions from my husband of like, is mom going to be tucking kids in? Are they not? How crazy are we getting? Like, just the realness. And it created this immediate rapport with the organizer because I was just real and honest. I wasn't trying to pretend to be something I'm not. And I think that's where we would really benefit as a party from being just a little bit more ourselves, because it doesn't take away from professionalism. It doesn't take away from your credentials. It doesn't take away from your ability to talk about policy and make progress and pass bills and support legislation that's really good for families. It just makes you a more real and likable person. And there's a lot of research that shows that likability is tied to a lot of these factors that I think a lot of modern politicians just lack because they're not in those environments where they're just interacting with normal people talking about normal topics. So I think it's a really good point though, and something I've thought about sometimes, even when I show up at events and I'm like in jeans and I'm like, should I have dressed up? But I'm like, no, this is who I am. And if I'm overthinking if someone's not gonna vote for me because I'm wearing jeans, then like I'm probably not the right candidate for them to vote for, you know?
I take your point. That's really interesting. I think it's an interesting, just from a communications marketing perspective, like there is a lot of power in that kind of authenticity. It's harder than the kind of more dramatic stuff to sort of brand and package because it's not just like, it would be easier if you already had that kind of elevated profile, right? If you were, for one reason or another, if you were the incumbent or you were the sort of anointed candidate or something like that, the money was already coming in, it was yours to lose, but people are already looking at you, then I think that authenticity is very powerful, right? I think the challenge is when you're in obscurity and you're trying to get to visibility, that's a harder thing than some other things to differentiate and package, though it's an interesting challenge, right? It sounds to me like what you're saying is, look, Dan, John Carter sucks might be a good way for you to go if you were running for office, Dan, but that's not who I am. Like, I'm a different kind of person. That's not authentic to me. So how do you bottle that so that you can become the person who everybody's looking at and noticing your authenticity?
Because I've never run for office before, I haven't had a lot of these conversations with myself of like, who am I, right? I knew my values going into this. I knew my goals going into this. I knew that I ultimately, like, I wanted to win, right? I wasn't doing it, again, to make an issue more prominent in the district or increase my name ID so I can use this as a stepping stone. I was doing this because I wanted to win the seat and go to Congress and serve people and do good by people, especially working families. So that is like my ethos, right? That's what I hold on to. But as I've gone farther and farther, I think I'm finding that because to your point, I have not had social media in years. I am a military intelligence officer. I have an active top secret clearance. I don't play around with social media. I haven't had it forever. I have a LinkedIn, right? But I'm not a self promoter, right? And so I have had to discover that voice, who I am, right? I haven't had social media since I was in my 20s. So I think a lot of this has been the pivot and not, again, overthinking how do things go. Yeah, if I could go back and do something different with the campaign video or even the look and feel of the website. I'm sitting down with a friend on Friday who just does a lot of strategic messaging and things like that. And we're going to just sit down and just like tear apart the site because it works fine, right? You can look at it and you get warm and fuzzy where you're like, okay, it feels professional. And a lot of the people looking at like the launch video are like, she's professional, right? You have to kind of think of your audience. We're not talking about general election voters. We're just looking at people who are like, okay, she looks legit. I hear so many people, they'll look at another candidate, not in my primary, but some of the other primaries, and they'll be like, God, the website is just, he's done, and they're using that as the criteria for whether or not that person can even compete down the road. And you're like, well, I mean, I don't know. I think that's he could be amazing in person, right? And like all he needs is to just adjust his website. So I think that even I wrote an op-ed and I felt really strongly about that because that was natural to me. That was like, my prose will capture how I feel about this district and why this guy's so out of touch. But you reread it and it's like, I'm talking about the CHIPS Act, right? So I'm finding my footing as a candidate and I think is just like a woman and, a 38-year-old working mom who is trying to figure out who I am and how I convey that to the world. I've been using social media more and more as a way to do that, to just have some like direct to camera where when there's something that I want to share with people, I share it. But it is really hard. And I think it is an evolution, I think, for any candidate. To your point, when you haven't been in the public eye, it's easy to sit down. And I had my consultants, we did this whole biographical sketch call, right? Where I went through all my background and shared a lot of kind of personal information and all that. And then they sort of crafted this narrative for the video. And it checks the block, but to your point, it's like, I think I'm getting incrementally more insights into who I am. So I'm able to sort of adjust that and broadcast to people why I'm different and what makes me different. But it's really hard to build that in flight. And I think that's another thing that's really challenging with these campaigns is you don't have and again, I mean, I'm able to do this full time. If you're working and you're at work every single day and you're also supposed to be doing fundraising calls, a minimum of 30 hours a week, and you're supposed to be doing this, how do you have the time for that introspection to just bring your best self to the table? And I think that the whole system is probably needs revisiting, but in the here and now, I'm doing a lot of reflecting on capturing who I am and doing the exercise of like, how do I want to pivot? How do I want to turn up the volume? Where do I want to take a little more of this risk, right? Because you're not used to everything. If you're on LinkedIn, it's like it's so formal and collegial and like just and now it's like, no, I have to go after people. I have to, engage. One of the candidates the other day posted something and somebody pointed out that there was like a pretty major factual error. And then again, he posted something and there was a factual error. And I was like, do I point it out? How do I do this? And it's those sorts of questions that there's no guidebook and it has to be based on what you're willing to do and not do. So I think I'm coming into my own as a candidate. And I think I've developed so much just empathy for candidates who do this at every level, because to put yourself out there is, I mean, we've made the choice. It was on our own free will, but nobody really prepares you for it. And I think it's really easy to listen to consultants, but I think there's so many amazing people out there who I think would be better served to just be themselves and just kind of be real. And you might not win your election, but you're going to connect with and inspire a lot of people who I think otherwise you wouldn't if you were sort of hiding behind the veneer of what you thought a political candidate should look like.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, and I think it's, when you look at most of the best candidates, the feeling is they have pros working for them, but the pros are ultimately taking their cues in terms of what the vibe and the vision of the campaign is from the candidate, right? And then you see a lot of candidates where you get the sense that they're getting that information from their consultants, from their team. And that's like, you can win that way if fortune favors you, but it's not, the best candidates aren't that. I guess, maybe last question or one of the last questions is, you brought up the idea that you probably aren't going to win the first time. Like, it seems to me often like unwise as a potential candidate to go into these things thinking you're like one and done. Like either you're going to win or you're out or something like that. But it's like, it's such a weird job, right? You have to like perform yourself in a way that most people don't in their lives, right? And you have to learn all these things on the fly. You have to build the plane as you're flying it. What a shame to like, if you lose, then like just like all that expertise and knowledge just kind of dissipates, right? It's like, we'll run again. People don't always seem to think of it that way. It seems like just for all sorts of reasons, it would be wise to go into it with the expectation that you might lose. And what that means is you take everything you learned and you go in the next time and try and do better.
I agree. I think that there's different routes. I think one thing that I've noticed in talking to like the donor class, right, who you're reaching out, your cold time is literally like cold calling very wealthy people with giving histories. And a number of people have just said, I don't give to political candidates anymore because it's like lighting money on fire. I want to give to something where I see the tangible impact of my giving through a nonprofit, through some kind of, whether it's time or money. And I think that that's how I'm looking at it. I got a question from one of the Democratic clubs when we did like a candidate interview process. They said, if you don't win, how are you going to help the other primary candidates, right? Are you going to give them your Rolodex? You're going to support them? The way I look at it is, I think a lot of people get really protective of their contacts or protective of their network or their fundraising donor base because they know that in 2 years, they'll be back in the same, or a year, they'll be back in the same position doing it again. So I think I look at it less as I'm never doing this again and more as where can I have the most impact, right? Maybe this opens my eyes to an issue or an underserved community that where I feel like I can really make a difference. Or maybe it's going and helping, volunteering with New Politics or some of these other organizations or the next candidate that comes up. So I think that it's more of a perspective to ensure that I am a good steward of information and resources to people instead of feeling like, this is my first go at it and I need to be territorial so that the next time around I am in a better spot to win. And I think that's sort of what's guiding my thinking. But I try to level with myself to think, okay, why am I doing this? Why? And I try to check in because it's really easy to lose sight of it. And it's really easy to be in friendly rooms with people who get really, really excited. And then you realize, man, I have this is a really hard race, right? When you're with a bunch of Democrats and they're excited and then there's 15 people in the room and you're like, man, I have 860,000 voters in this, or people who live in this district. Obviously, a fraction of them are active voters, but like that's a lot of votes to win. Like this is not easy, and there's a reason why TV and mail and digital and all these traditional tactics work. I'm not in any way saying they don't. I think we just have to think about for candidates who aren't able to execute on those. How do we start flipping some of these seats and bring our resources to bear? And that is an unanswered question for me, but I'm trying to do my best to keep moving ahead and would love to win this thing, but also I'm learning a lot and also learning a lot of areas where I think myself and fellow citizens and fellow Democrats can make a really big impact in future elections that I'm committed to carrying through on regardless of whether I win the election or not.
It's easy to feel helpless right now if you're a Democrat, if you're not on the side of the people who are in power, who, in my opinion, are exerting that power in this pretty awful and sort of irresponsible ways. It's very easy to feel helpless. And I think doing constructive work towards something you believe in is a way of not being helpless, right? Even if it doesn't lead absolutely to the outcome that you most want, it's a constructive, meaningful kind of work as opposed to just like bitching on social media or something like that. It's a way to feel less helpless, and I think that makes a difference, even if you don't win.
I've told friends who live in Austin, for instance, I'm like, most of you live in a safe blue district but you can feel helpless about so many things. But I'm like, go meet your fellow man, right? Go drive to other parts of Texas, volunteer, block walk, do parties where you're cold calling people and talking to voters and stuff. There's something very reinvigorating as a human to meet another human who maybe doesn't share the same political views as you, but just to connect on that level, I think it shows you that you put aside all this stuff at the top, and a lot of us are dealing with the same issues. We have the same universal truths. And I think that, for me, being out and talking to people, whether it's people who are going to vote for me or not, has been it just felt like a gift and a privilege to get to do that. So I would encourage folks to think about how you can position yourself, not just doing something in your house, but actually getting out and talking to people, because I think we could use a lot more of that. Again, even if the person's not going to vote for you or is never going to vote for a Democrat, I think with all the polarization, having those little touch points with our fellow man, I think makes a really big difference, and it will brighten your day if you go do it and restore a little faith in humanity.
Caitlin, thank you so much. So the primary is in March, and then obviously the general is in November. Maybe if you win the primary, I'll have you back on. Maybe I won't take an hour and a half of your time, but we can debrief. Best of luck.
Really appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me, and talk to you soon. Thanks.
This has been another episode of Eminent Americans. Big thanks to my editor, producer extraordinaire, Robert Scaramuccia. Big thanks as well to Alec Owensworth of Clap Your Hands, Say Yeah for letting us use his music for our intro and outro. If you liked what you heard, and I imagine you did, if you've made it this deep into the episode, then please rate us on whatever the relevant podcasting platform is. And if you have any questions or comments, email me at djops@gmail.com. That's djopps@gmail.com. I promise to respond at least until the faraway and probably mythical day when I have such a vast audience that I can't in good conscience respond to all the emails while still upholding my responsibility to my loved ones. Have a great day.